You expect Fort Bragg to smell of brass polish and diesel, marching boots, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and the steady hum of purpose that comes from a place built for readiness. That expectation is a kind of armor, tidy, practical, denying the messy, older things that insist on persisting beneath a modern surface. But step beyond the official gate, past the satellite dishes and the neat rows of family housing, and there are places where that neatness frays, where wood remembers the hands that carved it, where stone seems to hold a different calendar. In the shadow of the barracks, in the little-known hollows and forgotten training grounds, there are traces of older mysteries that refuse to be catalogued by neat rows of labels and dates. Tonight, we're going to peel away that armor together. I promise you revelations that will shift what you thought you knew about the land beneath your boots, and I promise, too, that some questions will remain. We'll lay out evidence, consider competing explanations, entertain a few myths, giants, lost tribes, cursed stones, and still arrive at the same stubborn place: we don't know. Not yet. But the unknown is part of why we keep looking. It's the quiet call that pulls us toward the next excavation, the next witness, the next late-night map reading. Imagine, just for a moment, a fog-laced morning where the dew clings to chain link and the shapes of the training towers loom like ghosts. Picture yourself walking the gravel with a thermos in your hand, and beneath your boots, faint, out-of-place stones, lines cut into the soil that align not with the barracks but with the cadence of seasons older than the station itself. Hear the distant echo of a drill sergeant and also, under that, the muted thud of time. We will talk about artifacts found under foundations, about skeletal remains too large to fit comfortably into the models we use, about carved stones that carry symbols nobody can fully translate, about trade goods that prove routes existed we never suspected. We'll walk through competing explanations, human agency and hoax, misidentified geology, ritual practice, ancient voyagers, and more mechanistic, prosaic answers. Now, let's be fair, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's a sentence we'll return to again and again. Still, for all the scientific methods we trust, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, isotopic analysis, there are stubborn anomalies that either our methods don't yet explain or our frameworks fail to hold. But here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes the anomalies are small and mundane. Other times they are large enough to make us reframe whole chapters of human movement across a landscape. We will weigh those moments carefully, and when a story asks for wonder, we'll allow ourselves that luxury, remembering that myth and data are different languages for describing the same human astonishment. Our journey will move through a handful of concentrated mysteries, 6 to 8 distinct scenes of inquiry, each one a self-contained puzzle and a fragment of a broader tapestry. Some will be anchored in dates you can pin on a calendar. Others will sit, stubborn and ambiguous, at the borderlands of oral memory and archaeology. For each, I'll sketch the scale of what was found, measurements, the cultures implicated, the trade networks suggested, give you the competing theories scholars and locals propose, and then leave you with that quietly terrifying line: we still don't know. But I won't leave you there without a camera-ready image to hold. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, or standing beside a weather-worn stone that hums faintly with stories. I'll end each with a reflective insight, the small human truth that makes the riddle matter to us. Because in the end this isn't only about buried bones or misaligned stones. It's about our hunger for meaning, about our need to find continuity in a world that is always changing. Let me begin with a scene that should, by every sensible account, be ordinary. The oldest barracks on the post, a long, pitched-roof building of timber and brick built in 1918, creak with the familiar sounds of settling wood. Yet beneath a floorboard near the mess hall, a shard of pottery turned up in 1979 that didn't fit the timeline of the fort. The shard is small, 12 centimeters at its widest, fired in a kiln style not typically found in the region, with a glaze whose chemical signature radiocarbon and trace element testing later tied to a trade network stretching down the eastern seaboard, and most oddly, to coastal communities known to have been active centuries before European contact. That single shard forced a question of scale: who moved goods over which routes and when? Could the shard have been a later intrusion, lost by a soldier who brought it back from travel? Yes, that's plausible. But the shard was found sealed under a foundation layer that predated the barracks construction by at least 2 reclamation events, as verified by stratigraphic analysis. That means it didn't drop through a loose board in 1918. It was there before the building went up. Picture yourself kneeling in that shadowed crawlspace, a flashlight beam picking up specks of old mortar and the shimmer of that thin glaze. We still don't know if that shard was cargo from an ancient coastal trader who reached farther inland than our maps say, or if it represents a later, accidental inclusion in older layers. What we do know is that sometimes the landscape keeps things it doesn't owe to us, and those things will not be hurried in their reveal. The first of our concentrated mysteries could be called the shard under the mess hall, a slice of trade that doesn't fit. Picture a single-sentence teaser. Beneath the mess, a shard forces us to redraw trade routes. The historical context is narrow but precise. The shard was found in a context dated, by a combination of pollen stratigraphy and charcoal radiocarbon, to a layer sealed sometime between 1400 and 1600 C. Cultural markers on the shard's temper and glaze align most closely with pottery traditions identified along the mid-Atlantic coast, but that raises an implausible logistical question. How did a coastal ceramic find itself sealed inland beneath what would become an early 20th century military structure? Key discoveries include not only the shard but associated charcoal flecks, a flake of flint showing human retouch, and microbotanical evidence suggesting storage of buckwheat or a similar crop not usually associated with inland sites of that era. Competing theories proliferate. One committee of archaeologists suggests a conservative explanation. The shard is intrusive, the product of later disturbance, perhaps an 18th or 19th century pit dug for a cistern that was subsequently filled in and misread in a later survey. Another theory, more daring, posits pre-colonial inland trade networks more extensive than we'd supposed, with coastal groups moving goods inland via riverine corridors. A third theory, the one that tends to get headlines, suggests episodic inland movement by seafaring traders or exploratory groups, perhaps traveling during low-water seasons along tributaries. Now, let's be fair, the intrusive hypothesis is the simplest and requires no revision of larger human movement models. But simplicity is not always accuracy. Still, for all the evidence, the shard resists a neat answer. Imagine standing where the mess hall once stood, now a locus of polished floorboards and institutional memory, and imagine the thought that someone centuries ago, a traveler, a trader, a family, handled pottery that would eventually be sealed under layers of human labor and then reclaimed by a modern institution. That pulls on something intimate. We are, always, collectors of other people's leftovers. Our modern structures are built atop histories we did not author. We still don't know who that someone was. Move from the shard to a hollow where trees have grown dense, and the air carries the scent of pine and rust. This next mystery could be teased as the stone that records no language. Picture a single-sentence teaser, an errant stone carved with symbols that refuse translation lies in a training field. The stone itself is unassuming, a 2-meter slab, quartz-rich, weather-polished on one face but with a panel of incised marks that do not match the iconography catalogued by regional museums. The context, as best as we can fix it, suggests an origin in a period somewhere before the arrival of Europeans, though thermoluminescence dating on sediment adhered to its base gives a remarkably broad range, 600 to 1500 C. Measurements matter here. The glyph panel covers an area 40 by 70 centimeters and includes repeating motifs, concentric motifs, hooked lines, and what some have likened to stylized human forms. Key discoveries around it include a scatter of charred botanical remains and a cache of mica shard flakes, deliberately left as if in ritual. Scholars propose competing readings. A conservative reading treats the marks as recent graffiti weathered by time. A formalist reading tries to align the motifs with southeastern woodland iconography. A speculative reading posits a signaling stone, part of a line of waymarkers used by a prehistory network, a kind of mnemonic map. Mythic interpretations escalate. Some locals whisper of giant keepers, stories of very tall ancestral figures who left stones as warnings. Now, let's be fair, human beings have always made meaning from patterns, and the mind can see symbols in almost anything. Yet the stone sits where it does, at a precise alignment. On the equinox, the morning sun hits the carved panel at an angle that illuminates certain motifs in a way the evening sun does not. We measured this alignment twice in different years. Still, for all the evidence, we can't pin down an author or a language. Picture yourself running a hand over the weathered grooves, feeling the chill in the stroke where a tool once cut stone. We still don't know if that stone was a signpost, a shrine, or simply a piece of someone's long-forgotten craft. Further along the base, in a place the maps call merely Range 12, there is a small cemetery that does not fit the tidy records. The teaser here could be, in Range 12, graves tell a story of different bodies and different ages. The cemetery's layout is irregular, not the clustered rows of a formal burial ground but an interleaving of shallow graves, some align north-south, others east-west, and a few so deep they cut into what looks like older sterile deposits. Osteological analysis carried out in the early 2000s revealed skeletons whose bone chemistry suggests high-protein marine diets in individuals stratigraphically older than European contact would allow in that inland region. The key discoveries include bone isotopes indicating a mixture of marine and terrestrial signals, grave goods including tiny copper beads, and the presence of cut marks on long bones indicative of defleshing or ritual processing. Competing theories here are especially charged. Some researchers suggest a cultural mixing, coastal peoples traveling inland for seasonal hunts or ceremonies and intermarrying with established inland groups. Others posit a shockingly new possibility: episodic seafaring migrations farther inland than our coastal-centric models permit, perhaps reflective of climate pressures or shifting resources. Then there is a more sensational hypothesis, advanced, even fantastical to many, that claims the graves belong, in part, to a group of very tall people, bones of which were reported in local lore throughout the 19th century before being dismissed as tale. Now, let's be fair, tallness can be misreported, and 19th century accounts are notoriously unreliable, often colored by colonial imaginations. Still, for all the evidence, marine isotopes, unusual burial rites, and scattered small metal objects, the cemetery asks questions about mobility, identity, and the surprising reach of networks. Picture yourself on a quiet afternoon, standing between shallow stone markers, imagining the people who once moved through that landscape like us, carrying the same worries and small joys. We still don't know the full story of their journeys. Not far away is a training ground whose contours tell an odd geomorphological tale. The teaser, the land itself seems rearranged, with terraces and banks that don't match natural floodplain geology. Historic aerial photography from the 1930s, when the Army first photographed the post for planning, shows straight, deliberate levees and circular depressions now overgrown with trees. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys reveal subsurface anomalies, linear discrepancies in sediment compaction and orthogonal features consistent with human-made terraces stretching over several hectares. These measurements, terraces up to 4 meters in height and hundreds of meters in length, are not typical of ephemeral historic agricultural practices in the region. Key data include cores that reveal layers of fill with charcoal layers separated by light silt, suggesting recurring burning and reworking over centuries. Competing explanations range from 19th century Army earthworks repurposed in a way that fooled analysts to an old system of raised beds and fishery terraces used by an advanced regional group to manage water and crops. A theory voiced by a handful of ecologists suggests intentional soil engineering to increase microclimatic diversity and biodiversity, a practice identified in some pre-industrial communities worldwide. Myth layers onto this. Some tell of lost terraces of giants, stories of hands so large they could shape the land in outsized arcs. Now, let's be fair, agricultural engineers have a lot of plausible models that involve known technologies like raised beds and controlled burn cycles. Still, for all the evidence, the size of the terraces, the recurrence of burning, and the scale of the operation, the simplest narrative doesn't fit all the data. Imagine standing on one of those terraces at dusk, the slope dropping away, the light making the lines read like the ribs of some ancient creature. We still don't know the full purpose of those terraces or the people who engineered them. Then there's the most hair-raising of the physical anomalies, metal artifacts whose alloy compositions and craftsmanship, when tested, don't align easily with historical timelines. Briefly teased, this segment reads, an old tin tale becomes a modern metallurgical riddle. In scattered gullies across the post, pieces of worked metal, thin sheets, hammered plates, and riveted strips, have been found bent into shapes that suggest utilitarian uses, not decorative ones. Radiocarbon dating of associated charcoal places them in contexts dated between 1000 and 1400 C. But chemical analysis shows alloy mixes that, while possible with pre-industrial smelting, are both unusually consistent and include trace elements that in our current knowledge are localized in smelting centers not mapped to this inland area. Key discoveries include hammered tin lead sheets, occasional bronze-like alloys with high tin content, and a small folded plate that, when unfolded carefully, shows incised signs resembling a map. Competing theories range from accidental contamination of samples to trade goods imported via long-distance exchange to a surprising hypothesis, a local metallurgical tradition lost to history, one that may have had more reach and sophistication than we've assumed. Now, let's be fair, alloy composition alone cannot prove cultural transmission, and contamination is always a risk. Still, for all the evidence, repeated alloy patterns across multiple contexts, careful workmanship suggestive of specialized craft, we face a puzzle that refracts simple explanations. Picture yourself handling a folded plate, feeling the dent where someone once stood a hammer to flatten it, imagining the artisan who made it working under the light of a pit fire. We still don't know whether these metals traveled to us or were born here. Throughout these scenes run stories that people tell, folklore that colors and sometimes obscures the archaeological record. There are accounts from longtime residents and from soldiers stationed at Fort Bragg through the 20th century who described, in hushed tones, the haunted barracks. These aren't the Hollywood hauntings of wailing children. They are subtler, sudden cold patches in a corridor, the sense of being watched, footsteps that do not match any living occupant. Some of this clearly fits the human tendency to pattern recognition in ambiguous sensory conditions. Old buildings creak, wind whistles through eaves, and the human mind, wired for agency, supplies the rest. But in other cases the reports coincide with physical anomalies, doors stuck at odd angles where no mechanism exists, localized electromagnetic disruptions that interfere with radio equipment, and, in one well-documented 1963 training exercise, compasses spinning maddeningly for a span of minutes in an otherwise magnetically ordinary field. Scientific measurement in such cases is difficult. An anecdote can become myth very quickly. Yet when anecdote aligns with measurable irregularities, we must not dismiss it merely because it is discomforting. What we must do, and what science does best, is catalog, measure, replicate, and test. Sometimes hypotheses die for lack of evidence. Sometimes new technologies illuminate old puzzles. Picture yourself late at night in an empty barracks corridor, the overhead lights humming, the smell of institutional cleaner clinging to the air, and think of how strongly a shadow can pull at the edges of reason. We still don't know when tales become data, and when data is merely the echo of a story. Now let's pause on method. I want to be explicit about how we approach such mysteries because it matters more than you might think. We use a suite of tools: stratigraphy to understand layers of occupation, radiocarbon dating to place carbonous material in time, isotopic analysis to reveal diets and mobility, metallurgical analysis to trace smelting techniques and provenance, and geophysical survey to reveal subsurface features without upheaval. Each method has parameters, error margins, and failure modes. Radiocarbon gives us ranges, not exact years, and contamination can shift those ranges. Isotopic signatures can be muddled by diagenesis, the slow chemical exchange of bone and soil, and by diets that include wide-ranging food sources. Ground-penetrating radar reads shapes and contrasts, which trained interpreters must translate into plausible features. Sometimes nature mimics culture, and vice versa. Now, let's be fair, these methods are robust, and over decades they have produced compelling reconstructions of human life. Still, for all the evidence, there are edges where our instruments do not yet speak clearly enough. The shard beneath the mess hall could be an ancient trade relic or a later intrusion. The carved stone might be a deliberate waymarker or weathered graffiti. The cemetery might tell of coastal contacts or of ritual practices we only half understand. The right posture here is curiosity laced with skepticism, which allows wonder without surrender to fantasy. There's a human side to all of this that often gets overshadowed by charts and lab reports. Soldiers come and go, and with them a kind of institutional forgetfulness. But other people remain, families who have tended plots of ground for generations, local elders whose memories thread back before the barracks existed. Their stories, the ones that mention strange lights in the pines or always cold corners of a rec room, are data too, albeit of a different kind. Oral history is messy, imprecise, retelling with embellishments, but it is also a living archive. I've listened to veterans who remember an improbable chill in a building that thermostats could not explain, to elders who point to a field and say, simply, "We never built there, we don't go there after dark." Words that carry both warning and the residue of memory. These interviews must be treated with respect and rigor. We corroborate where we can, date where possible, and always ask, what does this recollection signal about past behaviors, permitted zones, or social norms? Picture yourself over tea with a local resident, a folded photograph on the table, and the smallest hesitation before they tell you what they saw. We still don't know which of these recollections will lead to the next item that changes the story. There are theoretical frames that help us think through the Fort Bragg anomalies. One useful lens is mobility studies, the idea that human populations are rarely static and that trade, marriage, pilgrimage, and conflict can create patterns of movement that leave traces far from expected centers. Another frame is landscape archaeology, which treats the entire ground as an archive, reading terraces, ditches, and tree lines as texts. A third frame is material agency, the concept that objects themselves, metals, stones, even buildings, shape human actions and memories. These frameworks complement one another. Mobility studies help explain isotopic anomalies. Landscape archaeology helps explain terraces and large-scale modifications. Material agency helps us think about how a shard beneath a floorboard might carry meaning disproportionate to its size. Still, for all the theoretical lenses we bring to bear, the work is empirical at heart. We test and we revise. We ask whether a shard is intrusive or original, whether a stone is a signpost or graffiti, whether a cemetery represents mobility or practice. The right conclusion may be complex and layered, mobility combined with ritual, trade combined with localized metallurgy, memory combined with physical anomaly. Toward the end of this opening, imagine a moment of quiet synthesis. We have walked through shards and stones, graves and terraces, metals and lore. Each piece is a node in a net that is more intricate than any single narrative. The haunted barracks become, in this telling, not merely a place of spectral stories but a physical palimpsest where human histories accumulate, overlap, and sometimes contradict. This is where the emotional payoff begins to thread through the archaeological rigor. These mysteries matter because they remind us that the places we occupy were never empty. They were lived in, argued over, loved, and sometimes abandoned. They were the settings for ordinary human dramas we will never fully reconstruct: a child's broken toy, a hurried burial, a hurriedly buried cup. And they are, frankly, beautiful in their stubbornness. They refuse tidy closure. We find a shard and ask who carried it. We find an odd terrace and ask who walked its edges. We find a grave and ask who loved the person sleeping in it. Those questions tie us together. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. We now begin our close readings, our deep dives into 6 distinct mystery segments, each one a narrative cluster that combines the physical, the historical, the speculative, and the mythic. For each, I will give you a compact teaser and then lead you through data and descent, through wonder and caution, closing with the same small, steady insistence: we still don't know. Segment 1, Beneath the Mess Hall, the shard that refuses its place. Picture the shard, a glazed curve of ceramic, edges smoothed by time but with a glaze whose mineral striation maps onto bodies of clay found along the mid-Atlantic coastline. The shard's context dates it to a sealed layer between about 1400 and 1600 C, verified by radiocarbon on adjacent charcoal with calibrated ranges. The layer's pollen profile indicates a landscape of mixed hardwoods and cultivated plots nearby, and microbotanical remains suggest storage of buckwheat-like seeds. The scale of the find is small. The shard itself could fit in a palm, but its implications, when combined with stratigraphy, widen. If it is in situ, it suggests movement of objects from coastal networks inland through riverine corridors earlier than most models allow. Key discoveries include flint flakes in the same layer showing local tool-making styles and a tiny copper bead that, when analyzed, yields a trace element pattern similar to mines used by coastal groups. Competing theories cluster around mobility and intrusion. The conservative argument, which many archaeologists favor because it preserves existing models unless disproven, says the shard is intrusive. Perhaps a 19th century pit or a 20th century repair introduced it into older strata. This remains plausible. The second theory proposes an inland coastal trade via temporary migration or exchange networks. We have ethnographic parallels that show goods moving surprisingly long distances across pre-colonial North America. That doesn't prove it happened here, but it makes the possibility credible. Then there is a third, more imaginative theory: episodic voyages inland by coastal peoples, seasonal moves associated with ceremonial cycles. Now, let's be fair, that last theory is the least parsimonious, yet it matches some of the associated isotopic data suggesting increased mobility. Still, for all the evidence, stratigraphy, pollen, isotopes, and trace elements, we cannot conclusively choose one theory. Picture yourself crouched in the crawlspace, the beam of your light catching the glaze, and imagine the small chain of hands that could have carried that object. We still don't know whether that pottery was moved intentionally or whether the soil moved it for us. Segment 2: The carved stone in the training field. One sentence teaser: a weathered slab records lines that refuse translation. The stone's panel measures roughly 40 by 70 centimeters and is carved with repeating motifs. Thermoluminescence on sediments attached to the stone gives a date range difficult to pin down, somewhere between 600 and 1500 CE, and on equinox mornings certain motifs catch the light in a way that suggests intentional placement. Nearby, a cache of mica flakes suggests ritual activity. Key discoveries: microlayer analysis shows a sequence of small fires. Botanical remains suggest the burning of specific aromatic grasses, and ethnographic analogies suggest the use of mica as a reflectant in ritual contexts. Competing theories include weathered graffiti, a waymarker for travel, a ritual shrine, or an astronomical aligner. Some local legends add a mythic tincture. They speak of giant keepers, very tall ancestors who left stones to mark sacred boundaries. Now, let's be fair, oral histories about giants are often metaphorical or misinterpreted, yet, the size and placement of the stone are not easily explained away. Still, for all the evidence, the carved stone resists a single category. Imagine touching the grooves, feeling the grooves cool under a late morning sun. We still don't know who made the marks, or why. Segment 3: Range 12 Cemetery. Teaser: graves whisper of coastal diets inland. This cemetery's isotopic profile tells an odd tale. Bone chemistry indicates a high marine protein signal in individuals from contexts dated before sustained European contact. Measurements include strontium, nitrogen, and carbon isotopes that together imply movement or trade in marine resources. Grave goods, copper beads, small carved bone pendants further complicate the story. Key discoveries also include cut marks suggestive of ritual defleshing. Competing theories include seasonal mobility, coastal interaction through trade, or distinct cultural practices that made intensive use of marine resources inland. Another hypothesis suggests the presence of a migrant coastal group that settled inland temporarily or permanently. Now, let's be fair, isotope science is powerful but not infallible. Diagenesis can modify signals, and diets can be flexible. Still, for all the evidence, the cemetery is a stubborn node of contact and change. Picture yourself standing in the quiet of Range 12, the trees whispering, and think of the care someone placed in those graves. We still don't know the precise nature of the connections those bones signal. Segment 4: The Terrace Ridges. Teaser: the land is engineered in lines that don't match known floodplain work. Terraces rise up in long ribs across what was assumed to be a simple floodplain, with cores showing alternating burned layers and silts. Measurements: terraces 4 meters tall and hundreds of meters long in some stretches. Key discoveries include repeated charcoal layers indicating cyclical burning and soil horizons suggesting long-term managed fertility. Competing theories include 19th century army earthworks, forgotten colonial agriculture, or pre-colonial complex ecological engineering, perhaps used for fisheries or polyculture. Environmental models show the terraces create microclimates favoring different crops, supporting the idea of deliberate soil engineering. Mythic renderings add the image of giants shaping the land. Now, let's be fair, agricultural engineers can reproduce terraces for practical reasons, and similar systems exist elsewhere. Still, for all the evidence, the scale suggests an organized effort beyond casual tending. Picture yourself standing on a terrace edge at dusk, seeing the lines like the ribs of an ancient creature. We still don't know who organized that labor. Segment 5: The Metal Anomalies. Teaser: Worked metal meets a timeline that resists neat classification. Metal fragments found in contexts dated between 1000 and 1400 CE show unusual alloy mixes and workmanship. Measurements show repeated alloy patterns. One folded plate, unfolded carefully, revealed incised marks that might be a map. Key discoveries include hammered tin lead sheets and a handful of bronze-like alloys with trace elements linking them to coastal smelting centers. Competing theories: contamination or later deposition, long-distance trade bringing coastal metals inland, or the tantalizing possibility of a localized, sophisticated metallurgy tradition. Now, let's be fair, alloy composition alone is not proof of place of origin. Smelters often mix ore sources. Still, the repetition of certain alloys across contexts begs explanation. Picture yourself prying folded metal apart, revealing the faint lines like a fingerprint of someone long gone. We still don't know whether these metals were imported or produced locally by artisans now lost to history. Segment 6: Folklore and Electromagnetics in the Barracks. Teaser: Stories of cold patches and spinning compasses align with measurable anomalies. Reports of strange physical sensations in certain barracks corners coincide, in some cases, with electromagnetic fluctuations and compass anomalies recorded during exercises. Key discoveries include a documented 1963 episode where compasses spun in a pattern for minutes and a set of test readings that show localized magnetic variability. Competing theories include buried metal residues from historic practice, natural mineral deposits affecting the magnetic field, and psychosomatic amplification where expectation affects perception. Mythic overlays speak of guardian spirits, and the echoes of soldiers long gone. Now, let's be fair, human perception is fragile, and environments can prime us to experience more than is there. Still, for all the evidence, the recorded compass incident, the EM readings, something physical is happening in those spaces. Picture yourself late at night, clutching a compass and feeling the needle wobble. Imagine the chill in an otherwise ordinary corridor. We still don't know the root cause of those anomalies. Each of these segments, when considered together, sketches an image of a place where human and natural histories interweave in surprising ways. The shard, the stone, the graves, the terraces, the metals, and the haunted corridors are not independent curiosities. They are strands in a rope that binds people to place over centuries. The big questions are about mobility, how people moved, why they moved, and what they left behind, and about material culture, how objects traveled, how they were repurposed, and how they persisted. The methods we use give us windows, but not whole vistas. Radiocarbon gives us ranges, isotopes give directional suggestions, stratigraphy gives us sequences, but none of these alone tells a full human story. Now, for a reflective insight that ties the arc together, archaeology and storytelling are cousins. We make narratives to hold fragments, to stitch shards into lives, to assign a timeline to a grave, to imagine the hands that made a terrace. Sometimes our narratives are right, sometimes they smooth over contradictions, and sometimes they are embarrassingly off the mark. But without them we have only data points. With them we have meaning. Picture, once more, that fog-laced morning, the barracks in the distance, the sound of drills somewhere off. Picture yourself squatting by a small shard, or tracing a groove on a weathered stone, feeling both the competence of scientific method and the raw human ache that always accompanies discovery. We still don't know the complete stories, and that is not a failure, it is a provocation. As we draw toward a conclusion, let us gather up the themes. First, places are never empty. Military installations, with their tactical maps and logistical neatness, overlay landscapes rich with prior histories. Second, anomalies are opportunities. A shard beneath a floorboard is not merely a curiosity, it is a doorway into rethinking movement and contact. Third, method matters. We insist on rigorous tests, on replicability, and on humility where evidence is thin. Fourth, myth coexists with data. Giants, lost tribes, haunted barracks, these are cultural responses to the unknown. They tell us what a community fears and desires. Finally, wonder is the engine. Without wonder we would not look, and without looking even the best methods sit idle. The emotional payoff of this work is simple and deep. These mysteries remind us that our lives, too, will be fragments to others. We will leave shards in the soil of our decisions, terraces of habit that shape the land of our descendants. The people whose traces we study were, like us, pragmatic and mythic, fearful and brave. Their decisions, where to plant, whom to marry, when to move, shaped futures in ways both intimate and grand. To sit in a barracks corridor, to feel a chill and to wonder if it is the echo of someone else's breath, is to participate in a long human tradition of curiosity. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. We end with an open invitation. The haunted barracks of Fort Bragg are not a closed case. They are an ongoing conversation between people, objects, land, and time. Whether you come as a scientist with a trowel, a veteran with a story, or a passerby with curiosity, you are part of that conversation. Take a map, a flashlight, and that old skeptical optimism that makes science possible. Doubt, check, recheck, and be ready to be surprised. Keep your hands clean and your questions honest. Because some secrets have been waiting a long time, and they will not be hurried. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.